The Only Good Priest. Tom and Scott Mystery, Book 3. Author Mark Richard Zubro, St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 3. We placed our order. I eyed Neil suspiciously. "What truth?" I asked. "Let me tell this my own way," he said. I shrugged. He began with gossip about the people we just met. "You've heard of Monica Varlane, by reputation, of course. Her wealth and power go far beyond her gay newspapers. She owns real estate galore in this town. She has a stock portfolio that rivals mine." Nils' riches started from a nearly bankrupt waste disposal company left to him by his sugar daddy years before, when dark-haired, slender, muscular Nils Sparakos commanded the highest price of any callboy in the city. He'd proved frugal in savings, clever in management, and smart in investment. I raised an eyebrow about his knowledge. "Monica tells you a lot." "No. I have the same accountant. He tells me a great deal. He remembers the old days fondly. I still supply him with cute young things as his need arises." Neil explained that Priscilla Kapustaglava worked for Monica as managing editor of her local paper, the Gay Tribune. Priscilla kept the file on lesbian and gay political correctness in the city, reaching almost a guru-like status with the easily impressed Neil. Thought Priscilla must have an ambivalent view of Monica, probably envious of her money, jealous of her power, but so far desperate enough for a job to keep relatively quiet. Seems Priscilla had no newspaper training, but only a year of junior college in Nowhere, Iowa. "That was a fairly pussycat performance for Priscilla earlier," Neil said. "Why elect her head of faith?" I asked. "The woman can organize efficiently with a minimum of bullshit. She'll work harder with than any 10 people. I nodded that I understood. I'd worked with far too many gay organizations with the same problem. Two of the fatal flaws of many of these groups were total inefficiency and a tolerance for useless bullshit, unrivaled by any but the largest cattle herd on earth. After the passage of the Gay Civil Rights Bill in Chicago, I decided it wasn't worth putting up with all the bullshit, so I became less active. Priscilla had worked for Monica for 2 years. A number of years before that, Priscilla had shaved her head in protest over lesbians being excluded from power positions in Chicago's gay community. Now, there was Monica in what Neil suspected, in a position that Priscilla thought was hers by right. Priscilla had struggled for gay and lesbian rights in Chicago from the day she arrived from Iowa 15 years before. Monica established headquarters here 2 years ago and co-opted all power and attention. At first, Priscilla jumped on the bandwagon, thinking that lesbian power had arrived, unwilling to admit she'd confused satisfying her ego with attaining power, and facing 30, never having held a job longer than 5 months, she now rattled about the Gay Tribune office, monitoring whatever it was that politically correct people waste their time monitoring. Neil said Priscilla had been involved in a failed lesbian newspaper just before Monica stepped in with her money. He suspected a bailout or buyout. He'd heard rumors of personal and corporate bankruptcy on Priscilla's part. Neil said, "She's mixed up in that group, lesbian radicals from hell." "That can't be their real name," I said. "No, it's the usual officious crap of humorless radicals. Maybe it's lesbians for freedom in the face of oppression by evil non-woman who remembers." Neil began dunking one of the cinnamon rolls in his coffee. He took a bite, then continued. "I hate her. I know Priscilla had another meeting today. It should have gone on until we were done. I hoped she wouldn't show up at all. Her performance today was really rather mild, of course. Monica does step in, but that doesn't always work." Neil seemed somewhat in awe of Monica, although I suspected this might be simply envy at her riches. According to Neil, both women had liked Father Sebastian. Priscilla viewed him as the closest thing to a politically correct male she knew, and it tickled her fancy to find him in the paternal Roman Catholic Church. And the priest had responded to Monica's dignity. Neil guessed they shared an upper-class background. He couldn't picture either woman with the slightest motive for murdering Sebastian. Father Larkin constantly worried that his work with the faith group would get him in trouble with the cardinal. After the cardinal threw the faith group out of the Catholic Church, they usually had to go outside the diocese to get priests to serve the community. Sebastian stuck with the group and didn't worry about it. They'd imported Larkin from Milwaukee. Neil from often wished he'd go back and stay there. The man pontificated at the drop of a moral issue. He thought Sebastian had tolerated the man, but could report no animosity. "Why import priests?" Scott asked. Neil sighed, but paused before he spoke, swallowing. "I suspected most of a dumb jock crack." "Don't you read the papers?" He knew Scott had graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in engineering, but Neil had a college prestige streak in him. "Less than an Ivy League certificate, and you were suspect. My M.A. in English from the University of Chicago was barely acceptable." "I don't pay much attention to the gay Catholic stuff myself," I said. "You have no excuse," Neil said. "I promise if I ever get to pick teams, I'll choose you first," Scott said. This crack, I suspected, got to the heart of some very basic resentments. Neil had been a willowy wimp in his teen years. From what he told me, I knew the slights of his youth still rankled. Forestalling an eruption of hostilities, I got Neil involved in explaining. In late 1986, something called the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith sent out a letter supposedly approved by the Pope and signed by a Cardinal Ratzinger. Neil turned an ugly shade of purple, his voice steadily rising, fist banging the table, as he explained each point. "The homophobic bastards declared gay intrinsically evil and homosexuality an objective disorder, and they blamed us for our troubles because we stood up for our rights." "Who cares what the Catholic Church thinks?" Scott asked. Neil stared at Scott open-mouthed. "Some people think God is important in their lives." "Yes, but the Catholic Church? Who can take a church seriously that declares some man to be infallible? He's just some guy." "The Pope is not just some guy, and he's only infallible in faith and morals," Neil corrected. "I don't care if he's only infallible in balls and strikes. He's just a guy," Scott reiterated. "I wouldn't expect you to understand." Pity for a poor, ignorant jock dripped from Neil's voice. "I'm not the one going to hell for my sexuality," Scott retorted. Touché, I thought. But I didn't want to hear them bicker. I wanted data. "What happened after the letter?" I asked. Neil told the story. Bishops around the country started throwing gay groups out of their churches in spring 1988. Events came to a head in Chicago. The gay Catholics held meetings. Chaotic was Neil's mildest term for them. Tears and recrimination, shouts and threats, compromises, and desperate attempts at reconciliation all proved futile. Out they had to go. The faith group splintered in three, the largest retaining the faith name, kept most of the leadership, and moved to the old dance studio. They kept close ties to the national organization, which declared, probably heretically, Neil thought, that being gay was okay. The other groups named themselves Hope and Charity. The Hope group, as far as Neil knew, was still trying to work within the current church structure. The Charity group, smallest of the splinters, had something to do with the Council of Trent and Latin Masses. Neil didn't know any more about them beyond that. Personally, he was glad the two groups split off. The people remaining in the faith group now had a much easier time moving on their political agenda. He went on. "We even got the Chancery to send over their big deal troubleshooter, Bishop John Smith, to a meeting. I think he came because he and Sebastian were old friends from seminary days. Did no good. Smith was a total arrogant snot, and it takes a lot for me to accuse someone of that vice." During these meetings, I asked, "Did Father Sebastian take sides, lead any fights, make any enemies?" He paused and thought. "Not that I remember, no." He said that Sebastian had sat back, tried to help each speaker clarify his thoughts or express himself, tried to get people to listen to one another. "What kind of trouble could he get in from the Cardinal by staying with you guys?" I asked. "Hard to tell. If the Cardinal learned about it, he could get suspended from priestly duties." Neil shrugged. "Sebastian never seemed to worry about it." "Are all priests gay?" Scott asked. All the ones I know are, Neil said. It's an extremely closeted homophobic society. The most closeted ones being the most homophobic. Neil harumphed and returned to describing his fellow board members. Bartholomew was exactly as he seemed, a lonely old man terrified of offending anyone, especially Priscilla. Neil had known of the weekly visits from Sebastian, yet found this typical of the priest's kindliness. Clayton, a new board member, little known to Neil, was given to non sequiturs and drooling over sports heroes. Prentice was all new. I think you should get behind his flighty queen exterior. That boy knows secrets. I can feel it. I didn't know Sebastian met someone secretly. I thought you knew all the dirt in town, I said. Not like I used to. Plus, he's a bartender. They have a network all their own. Besides, I know he went downstairs after Mass before Sebastian died. You haven't said anything. No. I saw him only because I was down there too. Now he looked sheepish, a first in our relationship. I demanded an explanation. Every Sunday I went to confession after Mass. I gaped at him. He drew himself to full queenly erectness in his chair, almost knocking over the tray of desserts the waitress was offering him. He chose his dessert, a double helping of chocolate cream pie, looked at us, looked at it, and proceeded to devour it before he spoke. I will not be called to account even by you, Tom Mason, dear friend that you are, and I know you don't really want to know my list of sins. Unfortunately, far fewer than they once were. The point was that he'd gone down, confessed, and left a smiling Sebastian on his way back up the stairs. Neil had passed Prentice going down. He hadn't noticed Prentice return. I asked why he hadn't mentioned this before. Too ashamed to tell in front of the group, he exclaimed. That sounded lame to me. After knowing him all these years, he answered by reiterating that he knew of no reason any of them had to kill Father Sebastian, including Prentice. He didn't want to make public accusations in a group still emotionally upset by all the recent changes and divisions. Did Sebastian ever talk about this Father Clarence guy, I asked. No, he seldom talked about himself, much less anyone else. I repeated that I wanted to talk to Monica's source in the chancery. If we could break through the church silence, I was sure we'd find out what, if anything, had happened in the basement of that dance studio. He said he'd try his best. Before leaving, Neil told us Prentice had the 9 to 2 shift that night at Bruce's Half There bar. We might stop in and talk to him about his trip downstairs. We decided to drop the car at Scott's and walk to Bruce's a couple of blocks down North Avenue, just past Well Street, in a building that looked as if it had been put up the day after the Chicago fire. On the way, Scott asked about Catholics and confession, and I explained as best I could for someone raised in a vaguely Protestant home, but who'd grown up in a heavily Catholic suburb. He shook his head. Reared Southern Baptist, and knowing few Catholics as he grew up, he found it foreign. I don't see Neil doing something like that, Scott said. Belief makes people do weird things, I guess, was my only comment. Bruce's Halfway There bar is a very discreet, high-class bar. It used to be the only gay bar Scott would go to for fear of being exposed as gay. Now he'd entered any of them as long as he didn't have to put up with obnoxious gay fans who wanted to know the secret sex lives of all Major League Baseball players. I've never asked. I'm only interested in our sex life. It was a quiet Sunday night with all of 6 patrons, 4 of them seated at least 3 stools apart, at the long bar that ran the length of the left-hand wall as you walked in. 2 sat in the front porch, discreetly holding hands under the table, knees touching, 60 years old apiece, if a day, eyes only for each other, very much in love, it looked to me. After getting a couple of Watneys on draft from Prentice and asking him to join us when he got a minute, we checked into the back booth, a semicircular affair with high-backed walls. It offered all the privacy a frightened closet case could want. I liked it because it would ensure privacy in our interview. One company must make the cushions for all such booths. Otherwise, how could all the seats be the same dull red color mixed with a multitude of matching rips and tears in the fabric? As occasional hairdresser, bartender, and hustler, Prentice Dowalski lived one of the more unconventional lives I knew of. Whimsy and chance seemed to be his ruling passions on a given night. He might turn down $1,000 hunk of a trick for some little old man who'd saved for a year to pay $50 for half an hour. Prentice talked about his two arrests as if they were a lark, claiming he'd seduced 2 or 3 cops each time. Instead of lifting the partition and walking over to us, Prentice hopped to the top of the bar, twirled his legs over and around, and jumped down. He'd changed clothes from church. Now his pants clung tightly to his ass, hips, and legs, clearly outlining his dick and balls. The modified muscle shirt emphasized thinness rather than muscularity. Thin, combined with cute, can cover a multitude of sins. We got breezy greetings and slaps on his back. He sat with his right arm draped around Scott's shoulders, body intimately pressed close, left hand disappearing under the table. Scott gave him a mild look. "Sorry, I'm taken, and if you don't move your hand in 2 seconds, it'll come back broken." Prentice whooped with laughter, moved a discreet 6 inches to his left, and folded his hands primly on top of the table. His tenor voice existed just this side of an annoying whine. "You guys are so married. I bet you've never cheated on each other." 9 years we've been together. At the beginning, we promised each other we'd be faithful. I never have cheated. Neither has he. Or I'd like to think I'd know if he had. Now, of course, any sane gay couple didn't cheat or had to cheat, so very, very carefully it was hardly worth it. As a hustler, Prentice had told us numerous times, quite sanctimoniously, how careful he was to do only safe sex. I hoped for his sake he wasn't giving 2 guys in their late 30s a line he thought they wanted to hear. "Sad about Father Sebastian," I said. "A great old guy. I'll miss him," I mentioned. "I sold my body for a living to that other priest. That Larkin guy. I thought he'd have a stroke. Didn't faze Sebastian. Asked me if I made a good living and if I was happy. Never brought it up unless I did first. Neat guy." I asked if he agreed with the older people's idea that there was something strange about Father Sebastian's death. "Yep, sure. They're real adults. Stuff like that's important to them." He returned to the bar to fix a round of drinks and did his jump, twirl, and hop routine, coming and going over the bar. Youthful energy can be nauseating at times. "What'd you go down to see Father Sebastian about last Sunday?" I asked. He tried feigning confusion, threw in a little indignation, and settled into a pout. "Who says they saw me?" I gazed at him levelly. He turned to Scott, whose blue eyes have bored through tougher defense mechanisms than Prentice ever dreamed of. Mine in particular. Scott stared calmly. Prentice gave a guilty gulp and said, "Okay, so I went to talk to him." "About what?" Prentice evinced a pronounced stutter as he blushed and squirmed out his explanation. He'd been talking every week for some months with Father Sebastian about going to confession. His chosen profession provided the major obstacle. Prentice wanted to make a real confession, as he put it, a get into heaven no strings attached deal. Father Sebastian sympathized, but he wanted a commitment about quitting, or at least cutting back on the hustling. He himself had no special problem with Prentice's job, but he thought the church and God might. Prentice saw the logic in that ideal and agreed to meet with Father Sebastian each week, at least to talk over his sins, working up to a confession. Prentice had gone down to set a time for later that night. He claimed he left the priest humming quietly. He looked at me, head down, eyes and lashes raised, a la Lorraine Bacall. The effect was less than enchanting. He couldn't pull it off. I couldn't picture him going to confession either, but I didn't detect any lie in his voice. Maybe the kid wanted to get out of the life. Maybe he'd found someone who'd listen to him and take him seriously as something beyond a sex object. "There is one thing I should add," he smirked. I encouraged him with a nod. That night, he'd seen Bartholomew enter the John, heard the old guy cough and spit. The John was a 4x4 cubicle across the hall from the sacristy. When there weren't a lot of people or noise, you could hear men's or women's piss hit the water. Prentice reported this last with great relish. So at least 3 of them had made unadmitted forays to the basement a short time before Father Sebastian's death. With the John so close, any number of people could have come down and used it. Prentice interrupted my reverie. What you really want is the total deep dish. I know all the board members. I raised an eyebrow. He did the round of drinks routine and returned. You're running business. He pointed discreetly to a well-dressed elderly gentleman alone at the bar. You're looking at $1,000 trick, he said. Talk, I commanded. Mainly he knew about Priscilla and Monica. The younger woman had made a play for the older. Monica had rejected her, and too gently. According to Prentice's source, whom he wouldn't name, Priscilla still had the hots for her. I think it must be Monica's tits. I gave him a questioning look. They're huge, he informed me. I hadn't noticed. I don't pay attention to a woman's endowments. Now, a guy's crotch I can talk about fold by crease. There's nothing like a hot basket. Tight ass, broad shoulders, and solid stomach muscles. He continued. Anyway, just recently, dear Priscilla got pitched from an all-woman's commune apartment house after only 3 weeks. Prentice heard they'd got fed up with her more politically correct-than-thou attitude and ditched her. Monica let her live in the back half of the 3rd floor of the house. They used to put the newspaper together. Prentice had been to Monica's mansion, too. Actually, 3 houses on Wellington Avenue, between Broadway and Clark, that she'd bought and had renovated into one huge place. Furniture to die for. Each room better than a showroom. Glass from floor to ceiling. 10-foot Art Deco sconces from Vienna flanked the front door. The main fireplace was faced with bird's eye maple applied in a grid. He went on to describe numerous other examples of chic elegance. He'd taken a number of the gentlemen he entered to parties there, explored every crevice, and promised himself he'd have the same someday. Several new customers came in. He swung over to serve them. The last of the newcomers proved to be Brian Clayton. He spotted us and hurried over. Neil said I might catch you here, he said. We invited him to join us. He grabbed a Heineken and sat down next to Scott. He dithered a few moments, being the shy fan, but Scott's used to that and put him at ease. They talked curveballs and strikeouts for several minutes. Brian had a great deal of advice on how to pitch to certain hitters. Scott bore it all with equanimity. He'd gone through that before. Prentice saw Brian and didn't rejoin us. Brian said, I wanted to talk to you guys, partly because of Scott. I still can't believe you're gay. Are there other? Scott cut him off. Sorry. I've never asked how many gay athletes there are, and I don't care. Sorry. Curious is all. Scott nodded noncommittally. Brian also wanted to talk murder. After a weary glance to see that Prentice was at the other end of the bar and couldn't hear, he said, I'm not in with the other board members. They're real cliquish. A bunch of my buddies got together. We wanted somebody on the board from those of us who were newer so we wouldn't be ignored anymore. This was one of the reasons he paid close attention to new members each time. He wanted to get to them before the other faction did. Eventually, he and his group wanted to vote the others out. Seems Neil had ignored them, and they were totally fed up with Priscilla. I could picture Neil freezing them out. The old A-list gay syndrome from years back lurked very near and dear to Neil's heart. The old queen considered class and custom the cornerstones of Western civilization. That Priscilla's a bitch, Clayton continued, listing her many sins and slights. I never knew so many ways a person could be rude. At one meeting, I counted her nasty comments. None directed at Monica, of course. 4 at me, 3 at Neil, 8 at poor Bartholomew, 6 at Larkin, 2 at Prentice, none at Sebastian. He never saw any of them socially. Bartholomew and Prentice followed the lead of the others in treating him as an outcast. He resented it. He explained that he told us all this because he had knowledge of their movements that Sunday. I want you to know I'm prejudiced against these people from the start, so you can judge fairly when you hear what I have to say. I gave a nod of encouragement. He took a sip of his beer, wrapped his hands around the green bottle, and looked again to see where Prentice was. Leaning closer and continuing in a whisper, he told us that after Mass on Sunday a week ago, he'd been waiting for his lover, Arnie, whose parents were in town, making him late for church. He'd watched the door continuously in anticipation of his imminent arrival. He emphasized this several times. Then, after Father Sebastian had gone down to change, all 6 of the others had at one point or another gone downstairs, Priscilla being the last. Before Brian himself, no one else from the congregation had descended. None of them knew he'd been watching them. When he'd gone downstairs to go to the washroom, he'd heard noises in the sacristy. I went in and he gulped, then continued, "I saw him die. It was terrible." He paused to pull himself together. "That must have been awful for you," I said to break the silence. "Yeah," he said weakly. He took a sip of beer, shuddered, then resumed. "You seem like okay guys. I think I can trust you. Sometimes with those others, it's a fucking zoo. They don't have to be outrageous or obnoxious every minute. Even Monica and that damn cigarette holder were stupid." He didn't know what to do with his knowledge. He didn't want to go to the police. He felt a certain loyalty to protecting his own. He also was afraid the cops might think him stupid or might even suspect him. After our meeting with the whole group, he wanted to talk to us. So when Neil came back and told them we might be going to Bruce's, he decided to stop by. "How did you get along with Father Sebastian?" I asked. "He was always good to me. Went out of his way to make me feel welcome. If someone killed him, I'd like to see them caught. I can't believe anybody would murder him." We chatted with him a while. A nice enough guy, I guess. He left. A wrinkled hand gripped the side of the booth. Moments later, the head of another Faith Board member, Bartholomew Northridge, peered around the side of the partition. "May I sit with you?" he asked. I invited him to join us. He glanced cautiously around the room and fearfully back toward the doorway. Then he tottered over and dropped into the booth alongside Scott with so much force. I thought he might break some bones. He licked his lips, coughed, took out his hanky, and spit into it. "Monica said you'd be asking me questions about Father Sebastian's death." He clutched one quivering hand with the other. "I didn't kill him. I told him we weren't going to accuse anybody, just find out what happened." I told him he'd been seen and heard downstairs. His hands began wandering over his body, nervously picking at non-existent lint, scratching his head, rearranging the wisps of white hair that gathered randomly on top. He began rocking back and forth in unconscious motion. "I'm scared," he said. Gently, I tried to find out of what. He stared at me mutely for the longest time. Finally, his washed-out gray eyes rested on Scott. "You're famous, aren't you?" he whispered. Scott nodded. "When I was young, I was attractive enough to have all the sex I wanted. Now I can barely afford to pay for a little human closeness once a month." A tear glittered in the old man's eyes, rolled down his cheek. He looked at Scott. "May I touch you?" Scott immediately moved closer. Their eyes met, and the old man stopped shaking. Gingerly, Bartholomew reached a hand out. It landed first on Scott's shoulder. Scott's blue eyes bathed him in warmth. From tentative pats and caresses of his shoulder, Bartholomew rubbed his hand over the flannel shirt-covered arm down to the wrist. The angle of that set it in the back of the booth. Let me catch only glimpses of the next movements of Bartholomew's hands as they moved to Scott's kneecap. Then, with eyes downcast, he moved his hand nervously up Scott's thigh. He renewed the body, rocking with his hands inches from the folds of Scott's crotch. My lover didn't flinch. His eyes waited for Bartholomew to look up. With a wrench of courage, the old man brought his eyes up to Scott's. The rocking stopped again. Bartholomew took several deep breaths. Then the wrinkled hand moved to find the top of Scott's head, patted the soft blonde hair with 2 fingers. He traced Scott's eyebrows, nose, cheeks, left ear, chin. Finally, the tip of one finger touched each lip. Bartholomew's hand fell away, and tears coursed down his cheeks. He cried silently. Scott moved even closer to the old man, put an arm around his shoulder, and hugged him tenderly. No 2-year-old clung tighter to Scott's neck than Bartholomew did at that moment. Scott soothed him, murmured kind words, rubbed his back with one hand, held him tight with the other. After several minutes, I heard Bartholomew murmur, "Thank you." They unclenched. Bartholomew pulled out his enormous hanky, yellowed from years of overuse and inadequate bleaching. Scott remained sitting close to him, and after Bartholomew cleaned himself up, Scott put his right arm around his shoulder, took Bartholomew's frail, wrinkled hand, and wrapped it in his own. The old man laid his head back on Scott's shoulder, using it for a headrest. I explained to Bartholomew about checking each person's story and the need to find the person Sebastian met with each week. He gulped, squeezed Scott's hand, and nodded. He told us he'd gone downstairs to use the John, then stepped over for a few words with Father Sebastian, the only person who took time for him. Didn't laugh at him behind his back. He knew he kept the job as Father's face treasurer because Neil secretly checked his books and reports each week. I don't need his pity. I'm 82 years old, but I know my work. There was a fierce professional pride in his tone. He told us Father Sebastian was the only one who ever visited him. His parents and sisters died years before, and his nephews lived far away, and they'd never been close to begin with. Father Sebastian wanted me to get out more. He told me I should volunteer to help people with AIDS. I was scared. I know that's stupid. He told me I was silly. I got mad at him the last time he visited, so I had to go see him Sunday downstairs. I had to know if he was angry with me. He wasn't. He smiled so nicely, but he told me I had my health and I should help others, and he'd be taking me to Howard Brown Memorial Clinic this week. He hung his head and squeezed Scott's hand. I said I couldn't. His kindness made me feel so guilty. I said horrible things, then left as quick as I could. He gulped, but held back the tears. He sat straight in the chair. I'm going this week. I'll do whatever I can for them. I've got to make it up to them. And I'll help you boys, too. He grinned for the first time. I saw the gleam of his denture clips. He glanced around the room and leaned forward confidentially. Priscilla, he whispered. I've heard her. She talks violence, destruction, and murder. She threatened Father Sebastian last Sunday before Mass. Threatened to kill him. I don't know why. She scares me usually. She ignores me. Like I'm deaf and slime, but I hear. He tapped his right ear. I hear perfectly. He leaned back, perhaps exhausted by this confidence. I thanked him. Whether from lack of knowledge, trust, or energy, he told us no more. We chatted briefly, then walked together to the door. We offered to get the car and drop him someplace, but he refused, insisting he could make it on his own. He and Scott hugged briefly, then the old man disappeared down the street. We walked back to Scott's after the bitter cold earlier in the winter. The 40-degree weather in January caused us to linger as if it were 70 in June. I had Monday off in honor of Martin Luther King's birthday, but the next day's schedules dictated 2 cars. So we made the return trip to River's Edge. We decided to stop by the rectory to see if the good Father Clarence was all snug in his suburban bed. Perhaps we might follow him to the trysting place Frank Murphy had posited. We arrived at the church just after midnight. In the parking lot, a red Corvette nestled between 2 black Chevys. A gray Toyota pickup truck sat 3 parking spaces away from them. The only light in the rectory shone from the front windows on the first floor. Late-night visitors, Scott said. I guess priests can stay up late and party, I said. We parked halfway down Altadena Terrace, close enough to see who came and went. After 15 minutes, Scott said, What if the neighbors see us out here and call the police? I pointed to the ramshackle rundown house around us. On this side of town, they won't notice. Or they'll think we're cops. In a Porsche? Okay, they'll think we're drug dealers, which is even better. They'll know better than to fuck with us. After half an hour, he said, This is stupid. I said, Haven't you ever seen them do surveillance on TV before the commercials comes on? They always get a lucky break. He sighed. We couldn't see anybody's face from back here anyway. I started the car and moved us a quarter of a block closer. After 45 minutes, his fidget index hit its limit. Tell me why this is a sane thing to be doing. It may not be 0 outside, but I'm starting to get cold. This isn't summer here. The annoyed thrum at the back of his voice told me I'd better come up with some solid logic quick. He fixed his blue eyes on mine. A few more minutes? 15, solid limit. We leave no matter what. I shrugged, grudging agreement. 14 minutes later, the rectory door opened. Look! Scott pointed, still buttoning his coat and in non-clerical pants. Clarence hurried across the parking lot to his car. He tore off down the road. I made the Porsche purr after him down 161st Street to Wolf Road, through Makina, right on Front Street to Schoolhouse Road, a jog through New Lenox to Laraway Road, over to Route 52, then down to Manhattan. Just inside the little town, he turned to the right toward a cluster of two-story apartment houses. A block from the highway, I'd closed the distance significantly on entering town. He parked in the driveway at the first apartment house on the north end of the complex. The door opened before he knocked. "A sick parishioner," Scott said. "Not his parish. I saw a woman in a very short and sexy nightie. I don't think this visit was to bring her communion." "A girlfriend? Not unheard of. For a priest? There's got to be some heterosexual priest. Then again, I'm not sure." I told him my brother Glenn's story about the old priest who performed the wedding ceremony for him and Jeanette. The priest spent most of his time insisting that all the women in the parish loved him. "Setting up his heterosexual credentials?" Scott asked. "Sort of, except Glenn said he ruined the whole effect when he spent the entire reception solicitously checking out how much the handsomest young men had drunk." "Another fag priest," Scott said. "Probably." Glenn said it was embarrassing when the priest tried to be chummy. It was as if the guy thought a sex spy from the Chancery might be checking up on him. The lights in the downstairs apartment flicked off one by one. I doubted if Father Clarence had to worry about his hetero credentials, barely hidden at the edge of a denuded cornfield. I didn't want to wait for departure. If the Manhattan police stopped to ask questions, we'd be hard-pressed to explain our presence. Back the way we come, and home again. Home. "So, he's got a girlfriend," Scott said, as we sat at the light at Gouger Road and Route 30. I felt sorry for the guy stuck in his vows. No one to hold him in those special times, good or bad. Yet, he'd gone into it open-eyed. No one forced him to be a priest, as they had in the Middle Ages. In the car on the way home, Scott turned frisky and rather baldy. Even for a Porsche on darkened back roads, I managed to get us home with most of our clothes on. I made my mistake when I pulled the car into the darkened side of the house. Love in a Porsche doesn't have a lot to say for it. Even with our athletic acrobatics, discomfort reigned. We did a serious workout for 2 hours. Monday morning, after showers, we had stale Cheerios and milk, almost ready to turn sour for breakfast. "Great meal," Scott commented. "You didn't have to cook it. I didn't burn it. That equals gourmet around here. Shut up and eat." He had an 11 o'clock photo session at a cable TV station in Forest Park. He left and I drove to the River's Edge police station. Smack in front of the police sat a police car with 4 flat tires and a cop sitting behind the wheel staring ahead. He never blinked as I walked past him, up the steps and into the police station. Inside, I asked Frank what that was all about. He said, "A mistake," and offered no further explanation. I told him about Father Clarence's nocturnal wanderings. Frank raised an eyebrow and chuckled, but said he didn't imagine it had anything to do with Father Sebastian. He didn't want to doubt my nephew, but he hadn't been able to establish any connection between Clarence and Sebastian's death. I did find out some strange stuff. We walked to the gray conference room. Today the radiator gave off sporadic clangs. He tipped his chair back, leaned his shoulders and head against the wall and steepled his fingers. Then he rubbed them along the sides of his nose. "Good news? Bad news? What?" I asked. "Odd news. Information missing." I had to be very discreet. I tried a courtesy call to the cops in charge of the case, not the least interested in what I had to say. The cops had sounded bored and put upon, but had also evaded every question. Usually the city and suburban cops cooperated fairly closely. Many of them had trained at the Chicago Police Academy together and knew one another from way back. Most little suburbs didn't have the cash or manpower to create an enormously expensive training program for 1 or 2 cops. Instead, they sent them to Chicago, where they got some of the best training in the country. "Got nowhere with them," Frank said. "Wouldn't even let me check the files." I backed off quickly. They wanted to know my interests. I stalled them with a bullshit story about suburban cop paperwork. I don't think they bought it. Then he tried the medical examiner's office. An old friend worked there. Even this guy hesitated to talk, but finally he said one thing. In putting the files in order at the end of the week, he'd noticed the Father Sebastian report out of place. A quick inspection told him some documents were missing. He checked with a number of co-workers. No one had seen anything. Frank did his two-handed nose rub again. A few reports remained, mostly lab work that must have arrived after the other materials in the file had been taken. In fact, his friend had gotten the blood report back from the lab just half an hour before Frank called. Father Sebastian tested positive for the AIDS antibodies, Frank said. I guess I never really thought about there being a gay priest. Of course, I never really think about priests much at all. He was sure about the test. Yep. That couldn't have been what killed him. Nope. But what did is no longer in the files, if it ever was. Your friend make a stink? He reported it to a superior. The woman took the file and said she'd investigate. My friend's worked in Chicago long enough to smell a cover-up. He says this one stinks from Evanston to Gary. Some heavy shit is going down, is the way he put it. I told Frank what I'd learned from the faith group on Sunday. If he took his commitment to celibacy seriously, as they claim, how come he was HIV positive? Frank asked. Could have had a blood transfusion, or maybe they didn't know him as well as they thought, I said. I'd like to find the guy Prentice said he met every Sunday. Good luck, Frank said. So far, you haven't found anything to indicate Sebastian's death wasn't due to natural causes. I don't think you or I can do anything about the missing file stuff. I can tell you one thing. The initial cop on the case and his partner got called off it within days. That rarely happens. You might try them. He gave me their names. I left wondering how Sebastian had become HIV positive. Somebody had to be close enough to him to know. Maybe one or more of the 6 faith board members had held back information. I wondered if we had enough to pressure Clarence further, and I wanted to talk to the rest of the faith board about the tryst in the sacristy Sunday. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.